I gave birth to my second child at 11 in the morning, after a labor that lasted through most of the night before it. By the time the midwife finally left our house, it was almost 4 in the afternoon, and I remember lying in bed, feeling like my body belonged to someone else entirely, hollowed out, shaking, so tired that even holding my newborn daughter felt like lifting something far heavier than she actually was. That same night, Jonas came to bed beside me, and I understood, without a single word being spoken, exactly what was expected of me before the sun came up again. My name is Hannah. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. I married at 19 and I left at 27. On this channel, I tell the stories that were never supposed to leave our kitchens, and today I want to talk about something almost nobody outside our world understands. Something that still, all these years later, is difficult for me to say out loud clearly. What a husband is permitted to expect from his wife on the very night she has just given birth. I want to explain first what childbirth looked like inside our community, because it shapes everything about what came after. Most Amish women in our district gave birth at home, with a midwife present, sometimes a doctor if complications arose, but rarely in a hospital unless something had gone seriously wrong. There was no epidural in most of these births, no pain management beyond what the midwife brought with her and what a woman could endure through sheer will. Labor was long, often brutal, and almost entirely silent in the sense that a woman was expected to bear it with as much composure as she could manage. Crying out was understood. Complaining afterward was not. My first labor had been difficult, nearly 18 hours, and I remember thinking, in the exhausted haze of those first days afterward, that surely this was the kind of thing a marriage simply accommodated. Surely there was an understood period, even an unspoken one, where a wife's body was allowed to belong entirely to her own recovery before anything else was expected of it. I was wrong, and I did not fully understand how wrong until my second daughter was born. That labor was harder than the first. It stretched through the night, through most of the following morning, and by the time it was finally over, I had lost more blood than the midwife was entirely comfortable with. She stayed longer than usual, checking on me every hour, telling Jonas quietly, in the kitchen where she thought I could not hear, that I needed rest, real rest, for at least several days. I want to be clear that Jonas did not ignore what she said. He was, in his own way, attentive that first evening. He brought me water, he checked on the baby. He even, in a rare gesture of tenderness, sat beside the bed for a while in the early evening, watching our daughter sleep in the small wooden cradle beside us. For a few hours, I let myself believe that this labor, this particular exhaustion, might be different, that perhaps he understood, in a way I had not felt understood before, that my body needed time. That understanding did not last past nightfall. When he came to bed, I remember the specific quality of the silence that filled the room. It was not an aggressive silence. He did not demand anything directly, not in words. But there was an expectation in the air so familiar to me by then that I recognized it instantly. The same expectation I had learned to read in 100 other moments throughout our marriage. I told him, as gently as I could manage through my exhaustion, that I was still bleeding, that the midwife had said I needed to heal, that my body simply did not have anything left to give that night. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I have never fully been able to forget. He said that he understood. Of course he understood, but that a husband has needs too, and that those needs did not simply pause because a wife had just given birth. He said it gently, almost apologetically, in the tone of a man who genuinely believed he was being reasonable, even generous, by acknowledging my exhaustion at all before still expecting what he expected. I want you to understand that in our community, there was no framework, no language, no permission for me to simply say no in that moment, and have that be the end of the conversation. The theology I had been raised on told me that a wife's body belonged, in some essential spiritual sense, to her husband, the same way his belonged to her, except that in practice, in the actual lived experience of marriage, Only one direction of that equation ever seemed to be enforced. I did not have the strength to argue. I did not have the words, even if I had wanted to use them. What I had was exhaustion so complete that resistance itself felt like another physical task I did not have the resources to perform. So I said nothing further. And what happened that night happened while my body was still healing from bringing our daughter into the world only hours before. I want to pause here and say something important, because I have thought about how to say this for years. I am not telling you this story to shock you, though I understand it is shocking. I am telling you because I have since learned, through conversations with other women who left similar communities, that what happened to me that night was not an isolated cruelty. It was, disturbingly, common enough that women spoke of it in careful, coded language among themselves, the way we spoke of so many things that were never given honest names. There was an older woman in our district, a woman named Barbara, who had given birth to 9 children over the course of her marriage. One afternoon, while we were putting up green beans together, she mentioned, almost in passing, that her husband had never once waited more than a few days after any of her births before resuming what she called, delicately, marital relations. She said this the way you might mention a minor household inconvenience, a leaky roof, a stubborn hinge. I remember staring at her, trying to understand how something that had felt so singularly devastating to me could be spoken about so casually by a woman who had lived through it 9 separate times. I asked her, carefully, if she had ever tried to say no during those early days. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and what she said has stayed with me every year since. She said that saying no was not really something available to a wife in that position, not in any practical sense. She said a husband's patience was considered a gift, something to be grateful for, not a right to be demanded. And a wife who asked for more patience than she had already received risked being seen as ungrateful, as failing in the very submission that was supposed to define her worth as a wife. I think about that conversation often because it revealed something I had not fully grasped until that moment. The absence of an explicit rule saying a husband could demand this did not mean the demand was optional. It simply meant nobody had ever needed to write the rule down, because the entire structure of our marriages, our theology, our community expectations, made saying no functionally impossible for most women, regardless of what their bodies had just endured. After I left the Amish community, I spent a long time in therapy trying to understand what those nights had actually been. My therapist, a woman who had worked for years with people leaving high-control religious environments, used a phrase that reframed the entire experience for me. She called it obligatory intimacy, a term I had never encountered before. She explained that in many rigid patriarchal systems, sexual consent is treated as something continuously owed, rather than something freely given in each individual moment. A wedding, in that framework, becomes a single blanket consent that covers every night that follows it, regardless of circumstances, regardless of a woman's physical or emotional state on any given evening. She told me something that I have carried with me since. She said that true consent has to be renewable. It has to be something a person can give or withhold in each specific moment, based on what is actually true for their body and their heart that day. Anything less than that, she said, however culturally normalized, however wrapped in religious language about duty and submission, is not really consent at all. It is compliance extracted through the absence of any acceptable alternative. I did not have those words while I was living inside that world. What I had was the felt experience of lying in bed on the night my daughter was born, my body still healing, understanding that resistance was not a real option available to me, and simply enduring what came next, because enduring was the only tool I had been given. I want to say something to the women who might be watching this and recognizing pieces of their own experience in it. What happened to me, and to Barbara, and to so many other women in that world, was not something we agreed to in any meaningful sense. It was something we were never given the actual freedom to refuse. There is a difference between consent and the absence of resistance, and it took me years and a great deal of therapy to understand that difference clearly enough to stop blaming myself for not fighting harder against something I had never actually been permitted to fight at all. I do not believe Jonas woke up that morning intending to cause harm. I believe, the same way I believe about so much of what happened in our marriage, that he had inherited a framework that told him this was simply how marriage worked. That a wife's exhaustion, even hours after childbirth, was something to be acknowledged briefly and then set aside in favor of what he had been taught was his rightful expectation. He was not inventing cruelty. He was following a script that generations of men before him had followed without ever being asked to question it. But understanding where the script came from does not erase what it cost the women living inside it. It does not erase the specific memory of lying in that bed, my body still healing, feeling like even my own recovery was something I had to negotiate around someone else's needs. If you have ever felt that your body was not fully your own, even in the moments when it most desperately needed to be, I see you. If you were ever taught that a husband's patience was a gift you should be grateful for, rather than a bare minimum you were owed, I see you. You were not weak for not resisting. You were surviving inside a system that had removed the option of resistance long before that night ever arrived. This is my story. If it stayed with you, tell me in the comments, and subscribe if you want to keep hearing the truth from behind the prayer cap.